Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. In this episode, I'm talking to Bastian Greshake-Tzovaras, who joined the Software Sustainability Institute as a fellow round about the same time I did. Bastian has done a lot of work on citizen science, and I wanted to find out more about it. At the time of the interview, he was working in Paris at the Université Paris-Cité, in a very nice building right in the center of the city in the district of Marais, where I met him for the recording. This got us a bit sidetracked at the beginning, as there's quite a bit of a background history to this. But fear not, we eventually dive into his work on citizen science projects and his contribution to the Open Humans platform. Over to Bastian now. Hello, Bastian. Very nice to meet you today, live here in Paris. What institute are we actually sitting in?
So this is already a bit complicated. So the physical premises we are in are now called the Learning Planet Institute.
Okay.
And it used to be called the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity. And it rebranded just at the end of last year to show its more focus on learning sciences and collective intelligence, while it originally comes from synthetic biology and learning more. So there's a shift in focus over the last few months here. And it's in itself a non-profit association that's running this, but it's also associated with the University of Paris. Well, University of Paris until the end of last year when they renamed that one as well. Because
they seem to do that right often, don't they? Yeah.
The problem there was it used to be the Université Paris Descartes and Université Paris Diderot, which fused into the Université Paris. The problem was the University of Paris existed already in the 70s or in the 60s when then they destroyed it and made 15 smaller universities during the student riots out of it.
Okay.
But so now the other, because it was only 2 out of the 15 universities that merged, the other 13 were quite annoyed at this, that they didn't get to use the old name any longer, but the 2 had the audacity to reuse the name. And one of the universities that didn't merge was basically the law faculty of the original University of Paris.
Okay.
And they, of course, just went to the court and said, you cannot, that's also our name. And they won in front of the court, which said they need to rename it. So now it's the Université Paris-Cité, which we are affiliated with as well. And we are also here part of the National Institutes of Health. So we are a small research unit within them as well. So there is the non-profit association, which is administratively in charge of the building, but then the educational programs within with the university and the research is affiliated with the National Institutes of Health. So that's quite a long story for where we are.
That is quite a long story. But I think what we skipped, the part that we skipped so far is your introduction, because, you're Bastian, and we met during one of the fellow days after we got accepted as the Software Sustainability Institute Fellows. So that's how we met anyway. But anyway, over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself after you kindly introduced the University of Paris and its history?
So I'm Bastian. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute, and I'm leading a small research group within the place here, which is called the Peer-Produced Research Lab, where it's really about the co-creation of research with non-professional researchers, volunteers, enthusiasts, hobbyists. Yeah, so I'm here for now 2.5 years, and originally I'm a biologist. I have a background in biology. I did a PhD in bioinformatics, and because after a while I decided during my studies, the wet lab work is fun, but I don't see myself standing at the bench for the rest of my life. And analyzing data is actually more fun, and that's how actually I got into the whole software field, because I decided I would focus on this more, and ended up doing a lot of software engineering as part of this as well. And that's the connection to the Software Sustainability Institute as well, because a lot of our work here is developing digital tools and software for supporting people wanting to do research outside academia.
All right. Okay, my question was actually what made you apply for the fellowship at the Software Sustainability Institute?
The realm of citizen science at large, I think a lot of it is facilitated through digital infrastructure. So people create online platforms, tools for people to either collect data, annotate data, process data, which then is basically crowdsourced to volunteers who are willing to do this. Given this big focus on software within facilitating citizen science, I think getting them to actually adopt best practices and making sure that software there is not just a secondary thing really fits in well with, I think, the mission of the Software Sustainability Institute. My own interests is I've been a big proponent of open source, open science at large for many years.
I mean, that brings us to the next question, which is really citizen science. I mean, that's the subject for today. Could you first start by defining what we actually mean by that?
Yeah, citizen science really comes from two different traditions or disciplines, I would say. One thing, very historically, all science was citizen science. Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton, all of these people were not really trained scientists. They were hobbyists that decided to really understand the world around them and do research without any formal training. They didn't have a PhD in biology or physics at the time. No. But then with part of the professionalization of research in the 19th and 20th century, this kind of disappeared, and now it's very credentialized. All of us have PhDs if you want to be a proper researcher. But in the 90s, this actually changed a bit out of two traditions. There's one going back to Alan Irwin, a science and technology scholar from the UK, actually, I think, that came from this background of democratizing science. And it's a lot of like citizens doing research to address problems they have. This can be environmental. It can be the exposure to toxins in their neighborhood, for example. It can be the impact on workers that work in factories, like things where people do research to understand how their world around them impacts them. So it's really coming from society doing research that's necessary for them. The second tradition that was coined also in the mid-90s comes from ornithology, where citizen science, by not the name, but has been practiced for many years because a lot of hobby ornithologists go out doing birding. It's a big tradition in the UK. People go out and they do the survey of birds out in the nature for many, many years. Going back to this, there was the idea of citizen science of, well, we can involve people in actually collecting data for us. Because we are professional researchers, but we have only so many people that we can send out in the field. Why not get people to crowdsource the data collection for us? So it's a slightly different focus of one type of citizen science. It's really supporting traditional academic research, while the other type of citizen science, it's coming out of the interests of science, of society, and then using science to address these issues.
Yeah, but I think here at the Institute you focus on something rather specific, because you mentioned when you explained sort of how this institute sits within the framework of University of Paris, that it's health-oriented, is it? So in your aspect, what you're focusing on is citizen science for health issues.
Right. And I think there are both traditions of citizen science. There are where you ask people to participate in your traditional academic research study or your clinical trial, which in a sense, yes, you involve volunteers in this, but there's a very small difference to traditional medical research in a sense. And what we are doing in particular in my group is really working with patients or patient groups to help them do research to understand their own conditions and improve their own quality of life at the end of the day, which I think in particularly works well with many chronic conditions. And there is a famous example of Sara Rigari, who's a Parkinson's patient from Sweden. And she has a very nice figure she always shows. It's in every single year, she spends 1 hour per year with her neurological healthcare experts to actually manage her Parkinson's. But the year is over 8,000 hours, and these other 8,000 hours she spends by herself managing her own disease. So obviously she has a lot more lived experience and expertise in managing Parkinson's than the neurological healthcare expert she sees for 1 hour a year and has no idea what's happening with her. And she does research on herself, for example, how to spread out her medication throughout the day to minimize the side effects or to maximize the effectiveness, when should I take the next dose to actually make it last throughout the day. And it's just doing academic research on this on herself, and she actually just recently defended her PhD on how to manage her own Parkinson's disease. So she managed to do individual research on herself, by herself, and actually get an academic degree out of it at the end of the day. That's that's just amazing to me.
It is amazing. And yet it's when you started explaining all of that about citizen science, what struck me was the fact that you quite rightly pointed out that Charles Darwin and all the other scientists, I mean, a lot of that was by definition citizen science. So it's encouraging to see that this is a step of actually bringing it back in, saying that, yes, citizens who are not trained professionals can actually do science, and they can do proper science, and it should be taken seriously.
Yeah, and I think there is like an increasing interest in actually, in particular in the domain of health, to work with patient groups, to actually not only use them as the source of data, but actually use their expertise and experience. In France here, for example, the National Institutes of Health, they just, I think 2 years ago, started creating a service that actually tries to connect patient organizations with researchers within the institution. To say, okay, if you are a patient group, you have a research topic that's of interest to you, because that's another big problem. Academic research doesn't necessarily do the research that's of interest to patients, but whatever the academic researchers find interesting.
Yeah.
So they are trying to connect really patient groups that say, we have this interest, can you connect us to one of your researchers? To say, okay, and the patient group here is like, they are organized, they have 300 members in their patient organization already, which want to do this research. They bring you their expertise and the cohort of people participating in the research if you are willing to do the research on the topic they are interested in. So there is like a mutual beneficial collaboration that can happen as well.
Let's talk about some of the projects before we then go into the software, because a lot of that comes down to analyzing data and crunching numbers at the end of the day. But I mean, there are two projects that I think we talked about offline. One is regarding autism with the Turing Institute. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is one of those examples that's very similar to what I just described for the National Institutes of Health here. The project, it's called Outspaces. It's a collaboration between the Autistica Foundation in the UK, the biggest autism foundation in the UK, and the Alan Turing Institute for a project led by Kirsty Whittaker, who was leading the Tools, Practices and Systems group at the Turing Institute. And the project there really came out of the Autistica Foundation did like a goal-setting exercise of actually figuring out which topics do autistic people want to have research done on. And there we see exactly what I just described. If you look at the priorities that autistic people have compared to what research is being done, you see autistic people have very research needs which are very applied, like improving their daily quality of life, while academic research focuses on the genetics and molecular basis. If you're autistic, it's like, A, this doesn't help me at all, and B, this smells very much like you are doing eugenics, trying to get rid of autistic people in the future. So there's like a lot of mistrust also in the autistic community to research. So the approach really was to say, we take one of the topics that was prioritized by the autistic community, and in this case it was sensory processing differences. Autistic people experience their daily life different to neurotypical people. And so they might have particular challenges, like the metro might be too loud, the music in the waiting room at the doctor is too loud, like things like this, where just like for them it's really hard to experience this, and like small tweaks in the built environment could already accommodate them much more. And the project was really designed with autistic people from the start. So it was like, okay, you set the research question in a sense, but you also actually help us to implement the research protocol. And the research protocol initially was like, just, okay, we make a website where people can leave their experiences just in a free text form of like processing differences or like difficulties that you experience today. And it would be a website where people leave these, and they can also say how they try to cope with it. And you can decide whether you want to share it publicly or for research purposes or both, so that other people can benefit from it as well. In the process, actually, it was like the platform was designed with autistic people as part of the team as well, and really like helping to implement it and see what can, like, which challenges do they have using the platform as well. And one of the fun things was that, like, for a big problem, they said this open-ended question of like, which difficulties did you experience today? It's really hard for autistic people to answer. So your initial idea coming from academic research of like, this is how we will collect the data, like you will not be able to collect the data because the people that you ask to fill out these
wouldn't know
forms,
how to, or would
because
find
it's like it leads us to basically freeze us like, ooh, this is a really hard question. I don't know how to, like, you need to be more specific in asking the question even. So I think there's like a nice example of like why actually working with patients in this case, it's like, okay, like the initial protocol we cannot do. So, and yeah, it's still an ongoing project. It's being developed with the Turing Institute and volunteers, and we had a couple of students here from our institute actually working on this as well. And yeah, there is like a first prototype currently on its way, and hopefully soon launch.
When you talk about prototype, that is the platform, or
so it's,
could you explain a bit more what that platform
so
actually is?
It will be like an online platform website at the end of the day where people can write their experiences. It's tied to an anonymous user ID, and they can at any moment decide which things they want to make available to research, which ones to share with other autistic people or publicly, so they can very granularly for each experience decide who should see this. So the idea is really to have like a repository of these experiences growing over time. And of course, there's also an aspect to if you want to make things public, how do you manage the moderation of this? Who should moderate this? Like, of course, like ideally other autistic people should moderate as well. So there's like a lot of research governance where like the involvement of people plays a big role as well.
Let's talk about another project. It's with regards to trans women. And what is the aim of that particular piece?
Yeah, this part of research comes again from the community, and in this case from Clara, who was a master student here at our institute. So she is actually a software engineer by training and decided, because she as a trans woman is interested in transgender health and wants to do research on this, to do a master's degree in biology at the end of the day. So she enrolled here, and she came to me looking for an internship, which they have to do as part of their studies here, and was like, so I would be interested in doing some kind of research project on transgender health, and particularly maybe the neovaginal microbiome. It's a new organ that's created by gender affirmation surgery, and it can get infections just as the vagina of cis women. But if I go to the gynecologist, they might either not believe me that actually I have an infection, or because they say, well, it's not the same thing, this cannot happen, or maybe I can convince them to do a test, and the test will come back negative because they test for the pathogens found in cis women, and given that like the tissue is different, it might be different bacteria.
Right. Yeah.
So there is a lack of basic knowledge even to provide us with gynecological healthcare at the end of the day. We co-designed with her a study to actually collect data of the microbial flora of trans women across Europe with her. Clara and I, and together with Matt Ball of the Open Humans Foundation, we created the research protocol to really figure out like which data do we want to collect, in addition to the biological samples that people would take at home. So we would send them a swabbing kit at home. They take the swab from the comfort of their home and just mail it back to us. And then we can analyze the data from that. Also to do a survey of like, when did they have their surgery, which type of surgery, because there are many different types which use different tissue to create the neovagina. Which were the post-operative care things? Do they take probiotics? All these things to potentially correlate it. And yeah, the project was implemented really like collectively between the three of us. It was really fun. It's like the one thing is like you need to get ethics approval for this kind of research. So together with the community, we wrote the research protocol for getting the ethics approval. Did even a crowdfunding campaign, because the problem is getting academic funding for this. It takes forever.
As it always does.
Yeah, and particularly here, I don't know if it's in France worse than elsewhere, but like the main national funding organization has a single call for funding per year. And then it takes basically until November next year to get the money if you are successful. So basically you wait at least half a year to know whether you got successful or not. And if you do, then it's like another half year before you get the money. So it's like, okay, for an internship, which should last only up to a year, that's not...
It's going to be a tight thing. Yeah.
So yeah, we raised like 10,000 euros, give or take, on a crowdfunding campaign to really pay for the sequencing. Yeah, we just are now in the middle of analyzing the data. So we got 43 trans women from France, Germany, Belgium, and Spain. So we also translated all the materials in 4 or 5 different languages.
The commonality seems to be that what you're looking at in terms of software development is data collection and providing ways for citizens or for the researchers to enter the data. And let's talk about this, because I think you designed a kind of a platform. Is there actually a way, because the projects can be quite different, is there a way to actually abstract that and say we can come up with a common platform where we can do these kind of projects?
So that's actually the work we are doing with the Open Humans Foundation, and for which I wear a second hat part-time, which is the Director of Research for the Open Humans Foundation, where we created an online platform for aggregating and sharing data. And it's all personal data in the widest sense. We originally come from genetic data because we grew out of the Personal Genome Project in Harvard.
Right.
It's genetic data, it's wearable device data like Apple Watches, Fitbits, and so on. It's continuous glucose monitoring data for people with diabetes. The Autistica project, the Altspaces project, that's one that also uses the Open Humans platform for managing the consenting and the anonymization. Because in Open Humans, you can, if you sign up into one of the many different projects which are in this modular way running in the platform, what happens is that you create a normal user account on Open Humans, but if you join any of the projects, they just get a random de-identified 8-digit identifier for the person, and never their name, email address, or any of the other things you typically need to provide when creating an account somewhere.
That is something that I'm actually quite interested in, because there is a problem that a number of projects actually face. You have patient data that you need to store somewhere, right? So there's Peter Schmidt, who's entered with a hospital ID or with some date of birth, etc., with very personalized data. And then there's the research question, which needs to be anonymized. And then, of course, there's all the health regulations and the data regulations. So how does this work then in Open Humans?
The way it works is that what the main infrastructure of Open Humans really is just the data store and APIs. That's at the end of the day really everything that Open Humans provides.
Yeah.
People can join Open Humans and then they can connect to projects which either put data into the system. And we've written, or I have particularly written, like a number of importers for many of these data types I've mentioned earlier. So people can upload their genetic data from 23andMe. They can connect their Fitbit through an API, so it will automatically send all the wearable data on heart rate, activity, and so on into Open Humans to store a copy there. And many of these other things, and it's modular, so anyone in principle, you could go and write your own importer if you have a specific type of data.
Right.
You just write a small software that integrates the Open Humans API to deposit data, and that's it. And then it's stored by the data type or by the project that imported the data. So you have in your Open Humans account the data from these different sources. And then if you want to join a study, the study can say, I would like to request data from data source ABC. And if you consent to this, then the project gets access to this data that you've imported earlier, and also this random identifier about yourself and nothing else. The nice thing about it is that not only gives the researcher don't only get the identifier and the data, they also get the way to anonymously actually interact with these people. So you can use this identifier to send a message to each participant and say, could you fill out this additional survey with questions we have? Basically, you use the API to request sending a message, and we then send out an email from Open Humans to the individual, and the individual can respond in the same way in the other direction, so that no email addresses or anything ever goes between the individual and the researcher or the project lead.
So Open Humans, is that actually something that you have to install locally in your institute, or is that kind of a central application?
So it's
platform?
a central platform website that uses standard web APIs for doing all of this. And the Altspaces project, for example, uses it to manage their user accounts and store the data. So an individual that wants to participate in the Altspaces study and provide their data, they are asked when logging in, instead of log in with your Facebook, log in with Open Humans. They log in, Altspaces now gets this 8-digit identifier, and they can store all your experiences in Open Humans. And then you can decide if you want to make it public. Altspaces will take also a local copy to make it on their own website, but otherwise the data stays in Open Humans, where individuals can at any moment delete the data, revoke consent to any of these things which integrate with it. So very similar to how you authorize things to connect to your Facebook, your Twitter, and so on. You can manage your data there.
I think this is quite an interesting project that you're mentioning there, because I would imagine that there are a number of people who would be interested in joining Open Humans. How do actually people apply for using that? Is that something they can simply apply for access, or how do you get into that?
You don't even need to apply for access to get started. So you can, if you want to make a study on Open Humans, just create this, the API keys you need, just like you create an application for integrating with Twitter or Facebook. You get the API keys and you can start integrating the APIs into whatever you are trying to build for your study immediately. And the only limitation is it's limited to, I think it's 40 or 50 participants. in this state. So it's like the development stage. And if you want to make it publicly available on the Open Humans website, because it also lists as a repository all the studies being run, all the data integrations, then you need to request approval for what you are doing. And the approval is given not by me or anyone particularly running the thing, but by the community of users.
Okay.
So it goes into a public request for comments, basically. And people can say, yes, I think this is like a valid study, or this is like, this manages the data well, they explain well why they want access to this type of data. And typically then actually there's like a small discussion between community members where they say, if you are building something that's open source, there are some community members which will go to your GitHub and check how your code actually looks like. And like,
all right, okay.
I think you should like maybe turn on like HTTPS and SSL because otherwise it's not so great. Or like people give like detailed feedback on these things. And if you are doing this as an academic researcher, which you don't need to be, then you can also provide your ethics approval. If you have already gotten any ethics committee to look over it, you can provide the documentation, which will typically lead people to say, okay, if someone already, whose business it really is to look over this, approved this, then like it fast tracks it slightly. But it also means that you don't need to be a researcher to do this. So we have, for example, a patient group of cluster headaches that made their own mobile application to collect data about when they have their headaches, which interventions they tried, and things like this. Yeah. And they are running this by themselves as a group of patients. So in principle, there is no limitation that you need to be an academic to use this data. If you're an individual that has a good idea, you can use the same APIs, go through the approval process without going to an ethics committee even, and then use this data as well, if people opt in to giving you the data.
How do you actually store the data? Because at the end of the day, there is a central storage. Are you using one of the cloud services?
Yeah, it's all on the Amazon AWS cloud. There the data is stored and it's like encrypted at rest, yada yada, like all the best practices. There's the central data store in Open Humans, and the only thing that's shared when you join any project are credentials that someone can request a specific file in the data store.
The other question is, what is the history of Open Humans? Because I think that's quite fascinating that there's a platform that's being created for a number of different research projects. Because very often what we do in software engineering and at university is we find these kind of micro solutions where we have a project, we come up with a specific software solution, and time is short and we don't really have time to look around if something is available or ready. So how did you actually get started with all of this?
Yeah, so as I said, it comes out of the Harvard Personal Genome Project originally, which, if you're not familiar, it's like it was this idea that you would get a large cohort of people who are willing to get their genome sequenced into data then is put in the public domain for anyone to use whatever reason. Because they also wanted to pay for the sequencing of the people. So it took off very slowly. And then I think there was also the idea that maybe genetic data in itself is not everything. It's of course interesting, and as a biologist, I have an interest in genetic data as well to some extent, but there's a lot of other data, like microbiome data, as in the case of the transbiome study with trans women. There is wearable data, there is glucose monitoring data, lots of different data. And I think this is where Open Humans really started from. And then initially the idea was really to facilitate only academic studies, with the idea that you would get some academic partners on board, which either would like then deposit data into the Open Human system and really to reuse data. So it was about facilitating data reuse. I think what we've learned over the years is that academics are not super keen on reusing data in this way.
Okay.
Because the problem is, it's like in this type of participatory research, it's like a lot more work to reuse data than just collect it from scratch. You can integrate with the APIs and reuse existing data, but then you also need to talk to people and engage them and like convince them to opt into the data sharing. While if you make an announcement in the newspaper somewhere of like, we will give you a $25 Amazon gift voucher if you are giving us a biological sample, it's a lot less work. It costs maybe a bit more money, but it's easier and faster to do. So I think in that sense, that's when we shifted really to working with patient groups in this way. Because they have a lot of interest in collecting data and in analyzing this data as well. So that's another aspect Open Humans provide, is ways for people to analyze their own data.
So how big is Open Humans and how do you keep the lights on? Because, I mean, running AWS, that obviously costs money.
I think it's now, around 13,000 people that have registered. I would say around half of them have actually imported data and used the platform.
Right.
And how to keep the lights on? I mean, so we got some funding from different foundations in the past. So there was the Shuttleworth Foundation, which is well known. There was the Knight Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So they gave money in the beginning, and currently also, of course, there is academic grants because we do collaborate with academic researchers who want to use the platform. Open Humans, it's all open source, it's all free, you can use it if you want. If you want to invest the time to integrate the APIs yourself, or if you want our help in doing it, then you can write us into your grant to help you actually developing these things.
So you mentioned open source, so people can actually access it. It's not only that you can sign up to the platform, but you can actually go to the GitHub repo.
Yep. So the GitHub has like both the platform code itself for the back end of Open Humans and the website around it, as well as for, I would say, over 90% of all the integrations which import data. So both us as well as most third parties that create tools for interfacing with Open Humans release them open source.
If people want to contribute to it, is that straightforward? They just submit a pull request and then somebody looks at it and says, yes, that's okay? Or is there anything that needs to have them onboarded?
So I would say the problem with all web applications is that it's such a hassle to set up a development environment. As it interfaces with AWS, with like different tools, it's like... And most people don't want to do this, and I fully understand and appreciate. At the same time, it's like there's like lots of ways to contribute to the individual data import modules, for example. So they are all standalone web applications, which are very easy to set up compared to having to interface with all the rest, because they only interface with one API, which is the Open Humans API. Okay. So it minimizes the overhead quite a lot. So like I think contributions, if there is like a tool you would like data to be imported that's not there yet, that's pretty straightforward to contribute from scratch even. Or if there's an importer that doesn't yet do what you would like it to do and you have improvement ideas, that's quite straightforward. There's anyone who has an idea of like what they would like to see improved or added, like that's quite easy to do, and I'm always happy to help people get started.
So how long did it take to actually bring up Open Humans? I mean, I understand development is continuing, but I mean, to get to that point.
So I would say maybe this was actually before I joined. So I think it started in 2015, 2016. And I would say within a year, the initial version was there. Given the background of wanting to collaborate with mainly academics in the beginning, it was very monolithic. So all the data importers were part of the main platform and all of these things. So when I joined Open Humans in 2017, this was one of the first things we actually changed to say, okay, we should, instead of each new data importer needs to be part of the main code base, let's make them modular. They are all their own little standalone web applications, which means we have a much smaller code base for the main backend. Right. And also it's much easier for us to implement new things and improve them, because it's not that any pull request needs to check whether the main backend still works. But it's like, it's very daunting. Like, do you want to like change this data integration and maybe screw up the whole production development? Or if like you miss something, it only screws up one small part somewhere. So the thing is also all of our integrations use the APIs that anyone can use. They're all documented and available for public use, so we are really eating our own dog food. Okay. I think that's the very nice aspect as well. It's like, if we cannot make our own APIs work to do the things we wanted to do, then we cannot expect anyone else to do it either. So I think there's like a lot of things we learned over time by doing it in this modular way of like, we use our own APIs, like, okay, we need to change a couple of things here and there too.
Where do you see citizen science going in future? Do you think we're going to go back to the days, well, not going back in the sense that we have no professional scientists, but putting more emphasis on citizen science? Is that where you see it's going?
It depends a bit on the kind of citizen science. So I think like the European Union, for example, had a very big focus in its last funding rounds for the Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe on citizen science. But typically it's the one where it's really done coming from academics, and it's seen as a way to engage people And engage people often means providing free labor, and I'm very skeptical of this type of citizen science. So you're telling
you mean
me
free data collectors?
Yeah,
then,
so it's mechanical Turk, but you are not even paying me for the micro tasks I'm doing. But because it's for the greater good, which fair enough, I do understand the argument kind of. At the same time, it's but I feel citizen science can be more. It's really about engaging people in a meaningful way, giving them input into the types of research, making use of their expertise beyond it's just, our image recognition algorithms aren't good enough yet to automate it, so we still need a human. So I think there's a lot of potential for this, and so far the focus has been on this crowdsourcing type of citizen science, and I see that there's slightly a shift, at least in the ambitions, let's say. So the NIH here in France, for example, says okay, our strategic goal is more participatory research. And we started creating the service that connects people. So the ambition is there. How much of this is just empty rhetoric compared to actually achieving something? It's maybe a bit too early to say.
Yeah.
It could very easily go either way. But I think at least there is some interest, and that people say they want to do this. So now they need to follow up in a way on actually implementing things to help people do this more.
I think it's right that you point out that we need to look at the kind of science we're talking about. So, for instance, with people living longer generally, and that's a good thing, but also having more chronic infections, and you meant chronic diseases in general, it doesn't have to be only infections. I think citizen science can play an important part, and I think that's the part of work that you're doing. Do you see that there could be one area where citizen science plays a more prominent role in future?
To me, the medical field, not only based on my background in biology, that's maybe part of the reason, but also because I think there's really a huge potential impact for involving people. It's really about improving people's quality of lives and making use of the rich expertise patients have themselves, which very often is being quite ignored. We saw it with the transgender project, for example. I had never thought about these particular challenges. No one has done research on this yet, and it seems like such an easy project to do. I mean, we raised 10,000 euros and implemented a study. It's not that it's a €1 billion project that takes 10 years to do. It's you could do very small steps which already have a big impact.
I think we're coming to the end of the interview now. I think it's been a very fascinating discussion. So we learned a number of things about citizen science and, of course, of Open Human Platform. All the best for the future, Bastian.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me on.